Steinschneider in the BEE department here at Cornell, James Knighton at UConn. And just know that we do this, you know, knock on wood, we've been doing this for about 10 years and we'd like to continue doing an internship program. So we're always looking for partners and projects. I want to give a big thank you to the staff. Obviously, it's been a lot of work to put this together, particularly Rasil Sayez and Ingrid Seiden-Stricker put a lot of work into making this happen. I know Brian is always there giving us guidance too, but there was a lot of work in making this work. And I want to thank all the students for you know, being particularly scrappy this year and working on their own. So huge thanks to all of them. And I'll stop talking here. I just want to make sure everybody has their time. Just a few quick, just super quick logistics. Make sure to keep yourself muted, except in the Q&A. Put your questions in the chat. And let's get rolling. Our first speaker today is Harman Singh Dodi. He's a second-year master's in regional planning. Oh, I need to start recording. Just so you all know, we are going to be recording today's presentations.
I'm already recording it, Kristen.
Come again?
I already started recording.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Just a minute ago. Yeah. Great,
thank you. So our first speaker today is Harman Singh Dodi, second-year master's of regional planning. He's going to be presenting on his main project, but he also worked on the Climate Smart Communities project, the PFAS, and the Mapping Lake Ontario infrastructure. All right, take it away, Harman.
Are my slides visible?
Yes.
All right. Hi, everyone. So the topic for my presentation today is gentrification and heat stress across New York State. And I was supervised for this project by Kristen from NYSWRI and Libby from Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC. So this is an overview of my presentation. I'll be talking briefly about the project. I'll be discussing the gentrification index and the heat index, and then I'll be presenting the demographic analysis that we did for these indices. So this project is in partnership with the Hudson River Watershed program at DEC, and they are interested in identifying some social and physical resiliency matrices for helping the communities. And the deliverables under this project are a gentrification index and a heat index that was developed, which basically measure the stress that people face in these two categories. So whenever there is a new development that's coming into a neighborhood, or there's an ongoing development, or if like college-educated people are moving into a neighborhood in search of lower rents and affordable housing or more diverse culture, so all these processes lead to an increase in the housing prices and rents in those neighborhoods. And this might cause the people who were living in those neighborhoods before these processes happen to move out of the neighborhood. And this is basically what we identify as gentrification. So for the purpose of our project, we are defining gentrification as a displacement of people and culture, which is driven by socioeconomic pressures. And for the purpose of our index, we are measuring displacement by an influx of population and the socioeconomic pressures in terms of economic rent burden and a social class formation. I want to briefly mention that there are other aspects of gentrification as well, such as growth in the businesses in the neighborhood, as well as a change in the composition of the neighborhood. But we are not including those into our index because we are more concerned about an equity and justice lens. And what concerns us is the trauma that both physical and mental that people go due to increasing rents in the neighborhood when they have to compromise meeting their basic survival needs or paying the rent, which might even cause an eviction from the neighborhood, their displacement, or even people ending up being homeless. So this is why this project, the gentrification index, concerns us so much. So these are the variables that we have included in our in the index, and you will be seeing these abbreviations being used in the further slides. So the influx 2010 variable represents the new residents moving in since the year 2010. The GRAPI 35 represents the residents who are paying more than 35% of their income as rent. The GRAPI 15 variable is the residents who are paying less than 15% of their income on rent. The college education variable is the college educated population that are above the age of 25. And wherever you see a PR in front of these variables, it means that we have taken a percentile rank with respect to all the observations. And the GI stands for the gentrification index that we have developed. So this is the basic idea about the gentrification index. As you can see, there is like, there's both a gentrifying as well as a gentrifiable, that is a potential to gentrify aspect of gentrification, and we have tried to capture both of them here. Also, like all the variables capture a different dimension of gentrification. For example, the influx 2010 variable captures the displacement dimension that's taking place in the neighborhood. The GRAPI 35 captures the affordability of living in that neighborhood, and the GRAPI 15 captures the inflation in housing prices that's taking place in the neighborhood. And the college-educated population has been extensively studied in the literature, and basically it represents a social change that's taking place in the neighborhood. And I also want to mention that by taking GRAPI 35 and GRAPI 15 together, we have also capturing the heterogeneity that exists in the neighborhood in terms of the rent that people are paying. And for the index, we have used the census tract level data from the American Community Survey, which are 5-year estimates. And since these are 5-year estimates, so for comparison purposes, we have used like the 2018 data for our index, which is like the latest available data. But if we need to compare it, we will compare with the 2013 data since it's a 5-year estimate. So I want to quickly go through how the index is formulated and what the maps look like. And but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Or if you need more details, I'll be happy to provide them during the Q&A. So for each census tract, we get all the 4 variables, and we can map these variables in these maps, as you can see. And then we arrange them in an ascending or a descending order, depending on the association. And we take a percentile rank with respect to all the census tracts in New York State. And we get the percentile rank variables. And we get these maps. So in these maps, a darker purple color means that those census tracts rank higher in terms of that variable, and a lower blue means that they rank lower in terms of that variable. Then we add all these variables, we get the sum variable, and then we take the percentile rank of this variable, and we get the gentrification index. So this map shows the gentrification index. Here, a darker green color means that there is a higher value of gentrification, which can be interpreted as a higher susceptibility towards gentrification. And a lower green means a lower susceptibility towards gentrification. And this map shows a change in the gentrification index from 2013 to 2018. In these maps, a darker green color means that the gentrification index value has decreased, and a darker purple value means that the gentrification index value has increased from 2013 to 2018. So next I want to move to the heat index. So we all know that when we talk about heat, the most common thing that comes to our mind is temperature, but there's also a humidity aspect that when combined with temperature is what we feel as heat. So for the purpose of this project, we chose the United States National Weather Service's heat index, which gives an output of an equivalent feel-like temperature in Fahrenheit, which is what you will actually feel if you incorporated humidity along with the air temperature. And why should we care about heat? So with the increasing temperatures due to global warming, if people are not prepared for heat, or if people lack the resources to deal with heat stress, it can cause severe stress among the people, but it can also cause heat strokes and cardiac arrest and even death in some cases. So that is why heat is a very important thing to deal with, especially in New York State, where not much work has been done on heat earlier. So the heat index, the data for the heat index comes from the Prison Climate Group, who have developed a 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer unit size grid, where they have used some climate models to interpolate the weather station data that's available. And we are using the data for June, July, and August of 2018, which are basically the summer months here in New York State. This data set comes with the monthly average of maximum temperature and the monthly average of minimum vapor pressure deficit. And we are using these variables to derive the relative humidity and the maximum temperature in Fahrenheit, which basically go into the heat index to calculate the heat index value. So I'll quickly go through the formulation for heat index as well. And if you have any questions regarding these, I'll be happy to answer them in the Q&A. So first we download the data, we clip out the data for the New York State, and then we run that data through this GIS model. So what this model basically is doing, the left portion is basically calculating the derived variables, and the right portion is calculating the index value. And then we make some adjustments to the index according to the temperature and humidity range. I just want to quickly flash these equations that go into the heat index. As you can see, it's a conditional equation. So based on the temperature and relative humidity values, the index that we are using, the equation that we are using changes basically. And then we use the maximum heat index value amongst the months of June, July, and August. And then we map the heat index. So this is what the heat index maps looks like. The categories that you see here come from the proposed categories by NWS. And in New York City, as you can see in New York City and the Hudson River Valley, there's a lot of area that lies in danger category. And this map shows the same heat index values, but in decile categories. So this map provides a relative comparison of which portions in New York State are more, feel more hotter as compared to the others.
Harmon, 5-minute warning, okay?
Sure. So I want to quickly go through the demographic analysis. So we just wanted to see how these heat indices and heat index and the gentrification index vary across various demographic characteristics of a neighborhood. We saw variation across people experiencing poverty as well as the white population. And wherever you see a predominantly in front of a variable, it means that the population of that variable is greater than 90%. And wherever you see a majority, it means the population is between 50% and 90%. So these box plots show the variation of gentrification index and heat index with the level of poverty in the neighborhood. And the box plot on the left shows that the majority poor neighborhoods experience the highest gentrification index. And it increases as the poverty level in the neighborhood increases. And the plot on the right shows the variation in heat index, although you might see that the heat index is almost comparable, but we should take a note that majority poor neighborhoods often lack the resources and technology to deal with heat stress as compared to the predominantly non-poor neighborhoods, which is a matter of concern for us. These are the box plots for the variation in white population. And again, we note that the predominantly white population have the lowest gentrification index values, whereas the majority non-white and the majority white experience a relatively high values of gentrification index. And we see a similar trend in terms of heat index as well, which basically means like how that the predominantly white neighborhoods are less exposed to both gentrification as well as heat stress in New York State. And these results are in comparison with other studies that have been done in gentrification. For example, studies done by Department of Housing and Urban Development in Philadelphia, or study done by Center for American Progress across home ownership by minority groups in the United States. And they also gave us the same results. So I'm gonna briefly conclude my talk. So we saw into a gentrification index, which is a measure of social vulnerability or susceptibility. We saw heat index, which is a measure of both social as well as physical vulnerability. We saw how these index values vary across different vulnerable groups. And for the future scope of this index, we might need to check the robustness of this index and how we might be able to use this index further. I want to bring out that since we're using the ACS data, it has some limitations to it. For example, these are estimates and these are not actual census data. So these estimates have some assumptions behind them and we have to be cautious about that. And if there are better data sources available that are resolute to a neighborhood level, they should also be explored further. And these both indices are being handed over to HREP so that they can use it for further policy making and providing assistance to communities. Thank you so much for listening.
Great, Harmon. Thank you so much. We have a bunch of questions. We just have a brief amount of time, so we'll just get to the first one, but we'll compile the others to get to in the panel. First question was from Rick Geddes. Can Harmon say more about the mechanism by which gentrification impacts the heat index for the non-expert?
By which the gentrification impacts the heat index? Okay, so gentrification is a displacement, we are trying to capture a displacement amongst the population groups that's taking place, and this displacement can also be due to heat stress. For example, if there are some neighborhoods that are experiencing increased amount of heat stress due to increased temperatures, and they do not have any resources or the technology to deal with it, it might also cause a displacement in those neighborhoods. And when this displacement takes place, there might be some wealthy people coming into those neighborhoods, and then they would have the technologies and the resources to deal with the heat stress. So this is how gentrification and heat stress might be correlated.
Great. I just want to say one quick thing. well, let's see if you, I'll say one quick thing. If we can't get to all of the questions, again, we'll push them into the Q&A at the end. And then also, we have who you are and who's asking the questions, and we can have the students respond to those in writing if we don't get to them otherwise. Let's see, I think that in the interest of time, we should probably keep the rest of move on to the next speaker. But let's thank Harmon. Very nice job presenting your useful and interesting research. So our next speaker is, oops, excuse me. Our next speaker is Ellie, pardon me. Ellie Leap. She's a rising senior in environment and sustainability at Cornell. She also worked on, beyond what she's presenting today, she also worked on the Lead in Schools project. Take it away, Ellie.
Thanks, Kristen. Can folks see these slides?
Yeah.
I'll take that as a yes. All right, so I'll be presenting on equity in the Climate Smart Communities certification. And I worked with Harmon and Rewa and was mentored by Kristen. So just a brief overview. I'll explain a little bit about the CSC program, talk about the motivation behind this project, looking at equity, define equity, then I'll get into the results of our disparity analysis, look at lowering barriers to participation, and finally talk about next steps. So first, the program, Climate Smart Communities, or CSC, is a voluntary incentive-based program designed to support communities in taking climate action. So any municipality, that's village, town, city, or county, can participate. And there are 3 levels. So communities can register or pledge to the program or be certified at the bronze or silver level. And depending on the level, communities choose a certain number from over 100 available actions related to climate mitigation and adaptation. Starting in 2016, CSC started offering grants to help communities achieve the certification. They offer grants for funding for implementation and certification, and non-participating communities can also apply for these grants. There have been 4 application cycles from 2016 to 2019. The primary goal behind the program is to increase climate resiliency in these communities, but they provide a couple incentives for communities to participate. They provide recognition in the form of the certification status to these municipalities, as well as access to a network of other CSCs. So this project takes a step back to look at the program and look at who the program serves and who it leaves out. It also builds off equity work that Sustainable New Jersey and Sustainable Connecticut, which are 2 similar sustainability state certification programs that have taken some actions. And this project looks at how can we begin our own analysis in the CSC program of equity. There are many ways to define equity. This project, we focused on 3. First, access to opportunities. So are there disparities in which demographic groups participate in the program and receive its grants? Second, participation in the decision-making process. So what biases do the leaders have at the programmatic level in designing actions and approving grants, and at the municipal level in deciding whether to participate in the program and which actions to complete? And finally, impact on communities. So which communities within participating municipalities do the actions benefit or burden? This analysis focuses on the first, access, but makes recommendations on the second 2 aspects. Then thinking about equitable access in the program, we had 3 pieces. First, we look at demographic disparities in the certification program. Then disparities in who receives grants, the CSC grants. And finally, we tried to lower some of the barriers to participation in the program that we already know exist, like lack of funding. So first, the certification. We combined demographic data with data on which communities have participated in the program and performed 3 main analyses. First, we looked at descriptive statistics for all of the variables. Then we did a bivariate analysis of the certification status against each demographic variable. And finally, we did a multivariate regression looking at the certification status against the set of demographic variables. So these are in the interest of time, I'm just going to present the regression results. These are the demographic variables that we used. They're primarily drawn from the American Community Survey data. And they fall into 4 main categories. First, size, so population and community type. Second, economic, median household income and % below poverty level. Then race, % white, Black, Asian, American Indian or Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. And then political, % that voted for Obama or Romney in 2012. We then performed a covariance analysis to eliminate codependency between the predictor variables. And we're left with the variables in the red boxes for our regression. So the first regression looked at whether a community was certified based on its demographic characteristics. And from those suite of demographic variables, 2 were statistically significant. % that voted for Obama in 2012 was positively correlated with a community being certified, and community type being a town or village relative to a city was negatively correlated with being certified. So more liberal communities and cities are more likely to have the CSC certification. Second, we looked at disparities in the grants. Again, we performed the same 3 analyses with the same set of demographic variables and the same subset of those variables for the regression. We then looked at a regression of whether a municipality had received at least 1 grant based on its demographic characteristics. From that analysis, 3 of those variables were significant. % Black and % voted for Obama in 2012 were both positively correlated with a community receiving a grant, though those effects were very small, 4 and 8%. And then community type, being a town or village, was again negatively correlated with a community being certified. However, it's important to note that this analysis compares communities that have received at least 1 grant with all New York communities. And because many of the communities that apply for the grants are also pursuing the certification, we can't isolate the effects of the certification and the grants. We have begun an analysis of grant applicant data, so comparing communities that received a grant against communities that applied but have not received a grant. And those preliminary results do not show significant demographic disparities, suggesting that these effects are primarily from the certification. So our key conclusions are that cities are more likely to be certified. This result could be explained by cities generally having more municipal resources to pursue the program. Our second result being that democratic leaning communities are more likely to be certified. This also makes sense as democratic leaders tend to have climate change as a higher priority and thus might be more likely to pursue this voluntary program. And finally, that median income and racial makeup are not significant predictors of participation in the program based on this analysis. So in addressing these disparities, first, CSC leadership should discuss whether these disparities in size and politics violate the program mission. It's possible that because cities' actions serve more people, that does not pose an issue to the program's mission. It's also possible that because it's a voluntary, not a regulatory program, CSC expects that more liberal communities would be more likely to participate, and that's not something that they need to address. However, if they do want to address these disparities, they should consider options to both broaden the scope of which communities the program reaches, as well as tailoring the messaging to the different community interests and priorities. One idea to do that is to add a function to the program website to allow communities to enter their priorities and have actions filtered to the best fit, to perhaps reach communities that might not be initially interested in the program's main branding. Finally, we looked at lowering barriers to participation. The primary barriers that we already know exist are that there's lack of funding and lack of clarity on what implementing those actions looks like. We compiled—
Sorry, I apologize, 5-minute warning.
Okay, thank you, wrapping up. We compiled a list of traditional funding sources for each of the climate resiliency actions. And then we also explored creative financing options beyond traditional state grants for each of those actions. And finally, case studies of examples to clarify those actions. So it's important to note that this study looks at merely one angle of equity using one tool, statistics, which has many limitations. So we have several recommendations. First, in access, we recommend forming focus groups of unregistered communities and registered and certified communities of different demographic makeup to better understand the barriers that the statistics do not show. Second, in the decision-making process, examining and addressing bias in the municipal and CSC leadership, including seeking community input on how to address interests that might not be represented. And finally, evaluating the impact of CSC actions on demographic groups within participating communities. That's all. Any questions?
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ellie. The first, what we have in the chat so far is more of a comment from, oh, apologize. Okay, first thing we have is a comment from Terry Carroll, which is a good one and not surprising. The other factor with cities, and it applies to villages as well, is that they offer more services that can qualify for actions within the CSC program versus rural towns and counties as a whole. Excellent point. From Jess Cunin at New York State Sea Grant, might be interesting to think about how to measure inclusion in these programs. There may still be disparities in how these programs are carried out at the municipal level. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so that's something that is included in the recommendations, looking at that third piece of equity, impact on communities. So we didn't have a chance in this analysis, but hoping in the future to look at how those actions are distributed within those municipalities and how leaders execute those actions and how they affect either benefit or burden different communities. So that's a great point. Thank you.
Great. And we have another comment from Terry, who's deep in the CSC program. He's with the Tompkins County CCE. He comments that the CSC program has recently created an equity subcommittee. It would be good to share this with them. And yeah, Ellie, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, I would look forward to.
Yeah, we're working with Dazzle and I think the people on that committee. So hopefully they'll be. I don't know if she's here today, but we're working with them. And I think we have a question from Brian, our fearless leader here. What are the stated goals of the CSC program? Is it expected that more rural communities should equally contribute to pursuing those goals?
Yeah, so as far as the mission, what I found is that it's to educate and engage communities as well as support them both financially and offering like guidance on steps that they can take towards climate mitigation and adaptation. I wasn't able to find information on exactly which communities and community size they're targeting with different aspects, but I would like to engage in conversations with the CSC group and that equity committee to better understand that.
Right, I think, let's see, are there any other questions? No, I think we're at time. Wonderful, yeah, we can talk about it. Thanks so much, Ellie. All right, our next presenter is Rewa Fansalkar. I think I said that correctly. I should have checked with you. Rewa is a second-year master's in city and regional planning. Beyond this project, she also worked on the Climate Smart Communities program and the Mapping Lake Ontario Infrastructure program. Take it away, Rewa. And you're currently muted, Rewa.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
Hello everyone. I'm Reva, and this summer I worked on understanding coastal adaptation governance on the Lake Ontario shoreline in New York State, with a focus on identifying barriers to adaptation. Kristen was my mentor for the project. There was significant climate-induced flooding along Lake Ontario in 2017 and 2019, and the IJC's changed policy for lake level management was blamed for this. Whatever the real reason may be, this made it very clear that it's important to build local adaptive capacity in the region if we want communities to be more resilient. This project is a small first step to a much broader engagement that aims to do just that. It supplements more significant questions on specific local attitudes and hurdles to adaptation by documenting what institutes and programs comprise the adaptation governance framework and what common barriers communities face. On the left are the steps that I followed through the project, starting with an overview of the region to a discussion on the way forward, and that's going to be my outline for the project. In this process, I created some key compilations and documents such as the governance diagram, the readiness map, and the barrier matrix, which I am calling products. For context, the Lake Ontario shoreline makes up the northeast edge of New York and consists of 8 counties and 43 municipalities with frontage to the lake, which forms the geographic scope of the project. The region faces a unique threat from climate-induced lake level variability, where greater evaporation and extreme weather events cause high fluctuations in lake levels. This impacts coastal activity, erodes the shoreline, damages wetlands, and causes flooding. Outcomes are unclear and confusing, so it's important for communities to prepare for every possibility. It is also important to remember that lake level variability is different from sea level rise in the sense that lower lake levels are possible and just as damaging. So what is being done to prepare? To understand climate governance structure in the region, I compiled all institutions, programs, and other stakeholders into a governance diagram, which looks somewhat like this. The diagram maps various components like authorities, bodies, programs, regulations, and plans, and different relationships between them, whether it is participation, funding, or enabling, like in the case of a law allowing a particular initiative to exist. From the diagram, 5 levels of hierarchy emerge: international, federal, state, regional, and local. Each of these has differing mandates. It is also possible to see which programs are the most prominent by how many participation arrows connect to them. In this case, the READY initiative, the CSE program, and the local waterfront revitalization program all appear to be significant. Using the diagram, we can also trace a program's origins and funding source. For example, it's interesting how a small initiative in Sodus Point is connected to one institution at the regional, state, and federal levels each. For more accessibility, the diagram was also converted to a table that documents all components categorized by level, and I'm calling it the program inventory. FEMA at the federal, the DOS and DC at the state, and planning departments at the local level emerge as key players affecting adaptation governance. Programs by them, such as the community rating system, Climate Smart Communities Program, READY, and LWRP are all the most prominent. I documented participation across these initiatives in a readiness map for the shoreline. The map locates all funded READY projects with descriptions, CSC, CRS, and LWRP participation, and overlays all of this information with watershed boundaries, administrative boundaries, critical wetlands, and historical risk to flooding for shoreline communities. Overall participation is low. Only one town on the shoreline participates in the federal CRS, 10 are registered for CSC and 15 for LWRP. READY is the most active with over 132 projects funded. Also, data for Lake Ontario is prominently lacking, as is seen through the missing flood insurance panels along the shore. To summarize, it can be said that there is a thrust for adaptation planning at the international level, where various advisory documents addressing lake level variability have been published. Though some programs exist at the state and federal levels for communities to participate in, overall initiative is limited. And this is unfortunate because at the upper levels, the mandate is more advisory, and the primary regulatory power to affect resilience through controlling land use and development lies at the local level. So what should communities be doing instead? To gauge the status of community readiness, it was essential to define an ideal scenario to compare it to. I did this using the recommendations from the International Upper Great Lakes Study, CSC actions, and best practices from literature. An ideal community would adopt a robust planning process that starts with clearly defining the problem and improves itself constantly. It would implement strategies like planned relocation, green infrastructure, effective warning systems, as are all outlined in the CSC program. Overall, a prepared community would regulate development in vulnerable areas, participate in more programs, and prioritize equitable outcomes. Looking at the present state of adaptation and comparing it with the ideal, it becomes clear that there exists an adaptation deficit in the Lake Ontario region. This deficit is comprised of certain critical gaps in the way adaptation is thought about and specific barriers that prevent these from being overcome. The current situation falls short in various ways. Currently, no programs specifically tailor actions for lake level variability. Hence, threats from lower lake levels are not accounted for at all. Most effort is also reactionary and targets disaster mitigation instead of more long-term climate adaptation. Programs such as the NFIP can land up subsidizing the cost of living on the coast, and which can incentivize more development along the shoreline instead of regulating it. Even READY projects mostly build and rebuild in place. And though the effort that starts at top does not percolate to the local level, and even the effects of most of these projects that are actually implemented are not monitored or checked. To understand why the situation is so removed from the ideal, I compiled and synthesized a list of barriers to adaptation at the local level from various primary and secondary literature sources. I classified these by strategy and type, creating what I'm calling a barrier matrix. This is what the matrix looks like. The columns represent different strategies which expand upon CSC action items like effective vulnerability assessments and risk mapping, strategic relocation, and adopting green infrastructure. The rows represent type, whether barriers are institutional, legal, instructional, socio-cultural, or specific to achieving equitable outcomes. The matrix allows you to zoom in to see specific types of barriers. In this case, legal barriers to strategic relocation. We see that changes to local zoning regulations need to comply with state and federal law, and the prospect of ensuring this can often be a barrier that stops local decision makers from regulating land use. Certain commonalities emerge across categories. Lack of leadership, resources, and will is a significant barrier, and so is unreliable data, not having local projections, and not knowing exactly what to plan for. Adaptation measures often conflict with private interests, and communities can prioritize those more. There is also a mismatch of incentive and power, with federal and state institutions wanting to promote adaptation and local governments who have the most control prioritizing private development for, say, property tax reasons. There are also legal hurdles like heritage laws and the Permit 13 for building shoreline protection, which can all prevent resilient rebuilding. In conclusion, this project is just the first step to a longer engagement. The diagram is a mode of information for researchers and communities, and we mean to expand it through feedback from our partners. The barrier matrix can form the basis of identifying barriers more specific to this geography through interviews with local decision makers, and then addressing them in a more targeted way. The investigation of gaps also begs us to think about adaptation as a more transformative rather than reactionary, a practice that redefines boundaries of decision making, looks at ecological constraints rather than administrative ones, adopts traditional indigenous knowledge and ecosystem based management, and centers equity. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Trewa. Let's see. So far, we have a question from Jess Kunin. Oops. Jess Kunin at New York State Sea Grant. She asked, can you go back to the governance map from the One Sodas Point project? Cool visualization. So this is the zoom in on your institute. Okay, great. You want to talk through that a little bit, Rick?
Yeah, so sorry, was someone saying something?
Go ahead. No.
Yeah, so Sodus Point is currently doing a beach restoration through Ready. And the need for the beach restoration came through a post-flood recovery workshop that they conducted. And the workshop was organized jointly by the Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council at the regional level and New York Sea Grant at the state and the federal level. So it's just like through the diagram, I could trace where this initiative came from and how it was, like how certain adaptation measures find roots back through various levels of hierarchy.
She says, thank you. Right now, there are no other questions in the chat. Maybe you might spend a little time on your next, maybe a little more time on this institutional visualization, since this is where you are.
Sorry, Kristen, I didn't quite get you.
Maybe you could just talk through your institutional visualization a little bit more, these 3 slides around.
Yeah. Yeah, so a large part of the project was just figuring out how the governance structure works. And we went back and forth through making this diagram, then compiling it in a table, then finding ways of making concise information that communities could use to identify projects that they were the most interested in. And it's still a work in progress. The next step is probably to get feedback from WRI's various partners so that we can add more layers of information, think about how to classify things as being advisory or regulatory to see what the overall thrust of adaptation is in the region. And also to expand the matrix to include more targeted strategies to overcome specific barriers. Yeah.
Great. I have two sort of related questions for you, one from Brian and one from Linda Shai in the City and Regional Planning Department here at Cornell. Brian's question was, who is your main audience, do you think? And then I think related, Linda asks, Rewa, could you speak more to the policy implications of this complex governance diagram?
So in terms of the audience, I think right now it would be researchers and planners. But eventually, like, this structure needs to be simplified so that communities can identify initiatives that they can specifically go to when they have to address certain problems that their specific localities are facing. So because this engagement is going to be long term, I think the audience for it changes at various steps, but ultimately it needs to be useful for communities. Sorry, Kristen, what was the next question?
What were the policy implications of this diagram?
So right now, through the diagram, we just know who the key players are and who key decision makers are. So when I have identified gaps to, say, adaptation governance, like lake level variability is not specifically addressed, we know who are the people who we need to point this out to so that things can be done to address them. Even in terms of researchers making recommendations, at least through the diagram, we know that what are the prospects of collaboration so that more conversation can happen to ultimately create a policy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well done, Rewa.
Thank you.
All right. Our next speaker is coming to us from, Westchester County, where they have been experiencing, they just had the big storm blow through. So she is actually doesn't have power. I know she doesn't have internet. So she is a trooper and has come up with an alternative way. She recorded her presentation. So I'll play that for you in a minute. Her name is Caroline Smith, and she is a rising junior in biological engineering. Beyond what she presents today, she worked on a phytoremediation of phosphorus and the PFAS projects. So let me share her presentation with you.
Hi, my name is Caroline Smith, and today I'm going to be talking about the state of lead in New York State Public Schools, a project that I worked on with Ellie Leap and Rasil Sayas. It is well established that lead poisoning is extremely dangerous. In young children, lower levels of exposure oftentimes has few or no symptoms, but can lead to ailments such as reduced attention span, antisocial behavior, and other developmental issues. Additionally, it can cause other bodily damage, such as kidney and reproductive organ damage, as well as immunotoxicity. High levels of lead poisoning causes damage to the nervous system and brain, potentially leading to severe mental disability, coma, and death. Compared to adults, children absorb an estimated 4 to 5 times more lead from a given source. And although children are more susceptible, adults are still at risk for the negative impacts of lead poisoning. Exposure over time causes lead to be stored in bones, blood, and other tissues in the body. This is of particular concern to pregnant women, as lead can cross the placental barrier, negatively impacting the development of the fetus's nervous system. Severe lead poisoning in adults can lead to heart and kidney damage, anemia, and high blood pressure. The World Health Organization has stated that there is no safe level of lead exposure. Although some states and countries may set a certain level that cannot be exceeded when testing for lead, the truth is that any level of lead is dangerous. There are many ways to be exposed to lead, a couple of which are shown here. Soils can often be contaminated from lead-based paint in industrial practices. Additionally, lead-based paint is more likely to be found in homes built before 1978 and poses a threat to young children since they are more likely to eat paint chips or inhale dust contaminated by the paint. And although regulation has been introduced to prevent this, some children's toys can sometimes still contain lead in not only metal parts, but plastic ones as well. This is particularly concerning since young children are more likely to put toys in their mouth while playing, leaving them susceptible to lead exposure.
That's good.
The lead contamination that we are concentrating on in this project.
I apologize. Can everyone see this, Ingrid? Is this visible?
Only now, Kristen.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks.
Is that in water? In 1986, the EPA banned the use of lead in new plumbing systems. However, many of these legacy systems are still in place, and when they corrode over time, lead enters the water, contaminating drinking water supplies. In 2016, New York State mandated public schools and boards of cooperative educational services, or BOCES, to test for lead levels in their drinking water. The action level was set to 15 parts per billion, which meant that any testing site or outlet that had a lead concentration higher than 15 parts per billion had to be shut down or remediated, then tested again to be able to return to service. Schools had to test in 2016 and are currently in the midst of a second round of testing this year. In the future, they will have to test for lead at least every 5 years. After receiving results, schools are then required to report them to their local Department of Health, the State Department of Health, as well as the public. The overall goal for this project is to collect and analyze the publicly available lead data provided by the New York State Department of Health. In order to get a better idea of where the higher lead contaminations are occurring, we visually represented the data in the form of maps, and on the statistics side, we paired the lead data with census data, particularly median household income, or MHI, the percent of the population with health insurance coverage, and demographic data, which was all sourced from the American Community Survey 2018 estimates. Here we have a map of public schools in New York State, excluding BOCES schools. The blue dots indicate schools that had at least one outlet above the action level or one unsafe outlet, while the orange dots indicate schools with no unsafe outlets. Across New York State, excluding New York City schools, 52.6% of public schools had at least one unsafe outlet. And across the entirety of New York State, 34.4% of schools had at least one unsafe outlet. Here we can see a representation of the individual schools in New York State and the percentage of unsafe outlets within each school, where a larger circle represents a higher percentage of unsafe outlets within the school. Although it looks like there may be trends in certain areas, like downstate New York, it's important to note that there is a very high amount of schools in that area. Here we have a map of school districts in New York State, where yellow means the district has no unsafe outlets, and blue means the district has at least one unsafe outlet in one of its schools. Districts that didn't have lead testing data available are shown in gray. As you can see, an extremely high proportion of districts across New York State have at least one unsafe outlet. Including New York City districts, 68.2% of school districts in New York State had at least one unsafe outlet. This is a map showing the percentage of unsafe outlets by district. Again, it's pretty difficult to see any real trends visually, so turning to statistical tests to make definitive conclusions was very important. For the statistical analysis, two binomial logistic regressions were run with binary variables. The first looked at a binary variable indicating whether an individual school has any unsafe outlets versus district-level census data, and the second looked at a binary variable indicating whether or not a school district has any unsafe outlets versus district-level census data. Here we have the results for regression analysis 1, which looked at individual schools. For both of the regressions, we looked at the variables that you can see on the leftmost column. We did see some significant results here, particularly with the percent population with health insurance coverage, the percent of the population that is Black, Asian, and Hispanic or Latino. If we look at the estimate column, we can see whether the correlation between a given variable and the chances of a school having unsafe outlets is positive or negative. In the case of percent insured, we see a positive correlation, indicating that a population with a higher percent of its population covered by health insurance has a higher chance of having at least one unsafe outlet within its schools. We see the same positive correlation for the percent of the population that is Black. Looking at percent Asian and percent Hispanic or Latinx, however, we see a negative correlation, indicating that a higher proportion of the population being Asian or Hispanic or Latinx indicates a lower chance of having at least one unsafe outlet within schools in the area. So looking at our second regression analysis, which looks at school districts, we only see one variable with significance, the percent insured again, which also had a positive correlation, just like with the individual school data. The key takeaways from our analysis were that the percent of the population with health insurance coverage and the percent of the population that is Black are correlated with an increased chance of schools having unsafe outlets, whereas the percent of the population that is Asian, Hispanic or Latinx is correlated with a decreased chance of schools having unsafe outlets. It's important to note that our results are showing correlation, not causation. There are likely many other factors at play here that have led to the results we're seeing right now. Additionally, this is relevant for the unexpected results that we saw for the percent Hispanic or Latinx variable. We had hypothesized that there would be a positive correlation with this variable and the chance of having unsafe outlets in the district, not a negative one. Again, there are very likely other factors at play here that can explain why we received these results and help us understand the root cause of this issue. Additionally, it's important to take into account the data limitations that we had, such as the lack of actual lead concentrations, and potential census bias. The data that was readily available to us only indicated the number of outlets in a particular school that were either above or below the action level of 15 parts per billion, and did not give us the actual concentration of lead measured at these outlets. Additionally, the census stat has a long history of racial discrimination, culminating in modern-day issues that have led to the undercounting of minority groups. For example, the movement of Hispanic or Latinx from the race category to the ethnicity category in 2000 has led to the undercounting of these populations, as there is often confusion about which race to pick. In the context of our project, the undercounting of Hispanic or Latinx groups is very relevant, considering the results that we saw in the Hispanic or Latinx being correlated with a decreased chance of schools in the district having unsafe outlets. It's possible that inaccuracies in this census data contributed to this conclusion. Moving forward, future research should investigate and clarify the root cause of the correlations seen, as this would provide valuable insight into how to actually address them. Additionally, given our results, future testing should pay particular attention to schools with a higher Black population, and the allocation of resources for remediation efforts should take into account these results. Overall, this project has shown that there still exists inequity in access to safe, clean drinking water in New York State public schools. Exposure to lead is most dangerous at young ages, and within New York, certain groups are clearly more impacted than others, which is something that needs to be addressed. These are my references, and thank you. Are there any questions?
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline. Well done. I believe Caroline, can you hear us? Are you here on the phone?
Yeah, can you guys hear me all right?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay, great.
So let's see, if anybody has questions for Caroline, and I apologize about the video. If anyone wants me to pull up the presentation, I can show any of the slides that weren't as clear at the beginning of the presentation. We have one question so far from Brian asking if you want to care to speculate on what's causing your significant results. So that it's kind of a tricky thing to speculate on, but if you have some thoughts.
Yeah, so one of the ones that I know is definitely very interesting was the percent insured, because I guess logically you would think that a higher percent of the population being insured wouldn't really have any kind of correlation with, or it would be, it wouldn't have any correlation with the lead content in the outlets, or maybe it would be, you know, a higher population, more of a population that is insured would be correlated with a decreased chance of there being lead in the outlets. But we saw that there was an increased chance. So that's definitely something that requires more research, that would be something to look into in the future. With the percent Black being correlated with an increased chance of there being unsafe outlets within schools, that's likely, it does line up with previous literature that does discuss how a lot of like poor or communities of color are often more likely to be located near industrial sites and stuff like that. So it does line up with that literature. So it could just be a byproduct of that in some way.
Wonderful, thank you, Caroline. Any other questions about lead in school? Does anybody want me to show one of the slides that were not clear? I guess one question for you, Caroline. What if there was what data would you really? I know you were somewhat limited by the data that you had. If you had, you know, kind of perfect data, what would that look like?
Perfect data would probably be unbiased census data, but obviously that's very hard to get across. But I think that for the lead data, it would have been really nice to see the actual concentrations. And so that data is technically available, but for the scale of the project that we were doing, it just wasn't possible because the schools do have that data available, but you would have to go to each individual school and hunt it down through their website. We had actually tried doing that with a few schools, and some of them actually didn't have that data available anymore. They may have updated their website and it just got moved because the testing was done in 2016. So yeah, basically having the concentrations would have been really nice because, like I had stated, the World Health Organization has said that there's really no safe level of lead exposure. So actually looking at those concentrations and say setting our own action level to like 1 part per billion, it would have been a lot more interesting to see what would have happened with doing statistical analysis from that instead.
Great, fantastic. All right, well, I think we will stop there with Caroline's specific. There are a few more questions, but we can get those into those in the panel. Just let's thank Caroline for a great presentation. Thank you for being flexible and figuring out a way to make this work. I think it reflects well on this whole group that they've been able to do this all summer, find ways to make things work under tricky circumstances. So thank you very much. So now we're going to transition into the panel discussion. We have a number of questions still remaining from the Q&A. Let's see, after the talks. We got a nice, just want you to all know, great job on all the presentations. Thank you. That's from Robin Blakely Armitage at Cardi here at Cornell. But remember, so we can go through some of these. We have quite a bit of time now until 12:30, so we can both go. We'll kind of go through some of these specific questions, but then if people have some more general questions about, we can get to this later. But maybe, you know, many of the projects worked with similar data, so like working with census data. You also work with similar issues like equity issues, so we may be able to get to those in more of a comprehensive way. So be thinking of those as well. If so, continue to write your questions into the chat for now. We may, towards the end, open it up to more just direct. You know, we can let you unmute and speak on your speaker, but let's start with a couple of these that we didn't quite get to with the specific questions. I also realized I never introduced myself. I think many of you, I know I'm familiar with many of you, but my name is Kristen Hitchka, and I'm a research and outreach specialist here at New York State Water Resources Institute. And so happy to see so many of the partners and the students' mentors and friends and family here. Thank you all so much for coming to this today. It's clear that the students have worked hard, and it's great that they had a good audience with good questions here for them. So let's see. So starting with a sort of a specific question for Harmon from Katie Oren. I apologize, I don't know what her affiliation is. She's wondering your decision making to not include percent change in low income population in each tract in the 24 versus 2018 in your gentrification index. I've seen that used in several other attempts to map the displacement aspect of gentrification.
Yeah, so when we began with the literature review, like most of the studies do capture the economic aspects through either change in the income levels that's taking place, or the change in like the median household income, or change in the property values in the region. But most of the studies that have been done so far, they have been done on a very localized scale, like in a city or a county scale. But the study that we did was on the entire New York State. So we needed more objective parameters that could capture what's happening, irrespective of the factors that vary from let's say, which also comes with the question that Terry asked, that the cost of living in a city is different from cost of living in a rural area, for example. And and also like the cost of living between different cities is different. So in order to be more objective in that sense, we tried to capture the economic aspect in a more in a variable that actually measures the affordability and inflation that you're facing, which what we saw was the GRAPI 35, the percentage of residents that are paying more than 35% of their income as rent. So that was one of the reasons to get more objectivity in the index.
Okay, thank you, Harman. We had a question for Ellie from Brian about, he suggested perhaps the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals, apologize, it says could be a proxy. That's sort of out of context now. Sorry, Brian. Do you want to clarify what that was?
No, we can move on to the next question.
Okay, will do. Let's see. Next question. So we have a couple for Caroline. Before we move into new questions, please be either adding questions to the comments or to the chat, or again, we can start opening up comments. You can turn on your audio after we get through some of these questions now. So Caroline, another question here. Let's see, and I apologize, I didn't write. Oh, these are from Brian. This is from Brian. Given the nation's current census efforts, what is this work saying about the importance of counting certain populations?
I would definitely say that it is vital. I've heard a lot of talk about the census being ended early or being cut off somehow, and clearly it's not just this work, but I know the Climate Smart Communities project used a lot of census data. So making sure that the census is carried out in the most accurate way possible is extremely important for ensuring that we know what's actually going on with these issues, that we can get an accurate read of, you know, what needs to be done, how to address problems with not only lead and water, but any issue that's happening in a public sense.
Great, and maybe we can circle back to census data in a little bit here, but you had another question here from Ingrid Seidenstricker, who is our equity and policy analyst here at the New York State Water Resources Institute here at Cornell. And her question is, Caroline, could you